Hello everyone, let's talk about comic strips. In today's lecture, we're going to look at the growth of the Sunday colored supplement and how it eventually came into daily newspapers. One of the really extraordinary changes that happened in American language at the turn of the century with the introduction of comics was that all these onomatopoeic phrases that had been bandied around in those pages, people began to use in everyday life. H.L. Mencken noted in his study of the American language in 1919 that all kinds of phrases and the terms, what we now call emanata, were appearing in everyday speech and also in written language, and that this kind of transformation was a testament to the extraordinary popularity of comics at this time. Phrases such as the cat's meow, the cat's pajamas, for crying out loud, hot dog, the very word hot dog, both as a word for surprise and excitement, but also the term for that Frankfurter sold in Coney Island that had sort of dubious origins of its meat. Nobody home, you tell 'em. And the very popular Yes, We Have No Bananas, which became a hit tune at the time. Thomas Tad Dorgan was the cartoonist who was very instrumental in the popularization of a lot of these phrases and words. The comic strip that really launched comics in the popular medium as we know it today was Rudolph Dirks' Katzenjammer Kids, which began in 1897. Rudolph Dirks was working for a Hearst paper when Rudolf Hearst had come back from a trip to Europe, where he had picked up a volume of Max and Moritz, the picture story by Wilhelm Busch. Now, he turned to Rudolph Dirks and says, "Can you make a comic strip out of this picture story?" And he went at it and very soon had these two rambunctious kids who were constantly making trouble for their parents. Now, the word Katzenjammer is a colloquialism in the inner city immigrants. It means a sort of howling cat, and it is used to mean a hangover. And we see the life of this rough and tumble family that speaks in this sort of broken English with this heavy German accent. This proved enormously popular. But over time, to expand his audience, Rudolph Dirks decided to shift his strip away from its focus on the inner city of New York City and created a new piece based on the same characters, but now put them in a kind of fantasy island and called it Captain and the Kids. Now, this new strip, Captain and the Kids, coincided with a growth in syndication of the comic strips. Comic strips were very expensive for individual papers to maintain, to have an artist on staff, and then to have the ability to do all the color separation and other technical things that were required to make a comic strip work. They decided to start to pool their resources so that comic strips from one paper would be shared among a whole group of papers that were all sort of collectively owned by a company. This syndication became a very powerful means for a comic strip to appear all over the country in hundreds and hundreds of newspapers. And that's why these characters became household names, and their language and their antics became commonplace sources of amusement. One of the early heroes of the comic strip was Winsor McCay in his Dreams of Rarebit Fiend. This was a really rather odd and quite dark comic which involved a standalone story. There were no recurring characters, and in it there was always some fantastic thing that began. In this case, we have this man who is a titan, and he's wandering through the city, sitting on bridges, carousing with Lady Liberty, and finally just kind of smashing it all down and picking up the train. Eventually, he finds himself awake in a prison, and he finds himself having had a dream, and he remembers he had this rare bit, and that was what caused him this crazy nightmare. The last frame is always a person in some kind of dream, and they are startled awake by something that's happened to them in their sleep. And this is one of the things that's really quite fascinating about Winsor McCay, is a sort of psychological way this man acting like he's the king of the world and going about his business as if everything is his oyster, only to find himself locked up in prison being chided by the prison guard. And so this was a really fascinating idea for Winsor McCay. Now, the idea of the rarebit. What is rarebit? Welsh rarebit is a alcoholic cheese fondue that was quite popular in the city at this time. And it became a way in which Winsor McCay could give a kind of temperance speech on the idea of moderation by sort of making fun of people who had overindulged in Welsh rarebit. So the dream of the rarebit fiend was incredibly inventive in its use of manipulation of space and the characters and distorting them in this really amazing way. As I mentioned, dreams of a rarebit fiend could be quite dark. In this strip here, we see from the perspective of someone looking up, and they're talking about the deceased. And then you slowly realize you are the deceased lying in the coffin, and they are burying you in it. And last panel, as per usual, the character wakes up terrified. Oh, Mary, I'll be good. I'll be good. Oh, shucks, it's a dream. Good. I ate cheese pie last night, and oh, what a dream. Truth be told, cheese does provide weird dreams. That is a very limited study that was done in England found that that was commonly the case. Some cheeses are more effective than other, they found. So the dream of the rarebit fiend was either a black and white feature or, in this case, a full-page color feature in the newspaper. And these were big papers. These were large, spectacular pages that are filled with colorful, exciting, strange spectacles that people thoroughly enjoyed. And that was something that Winsor McCay was so good at, really creating an illusion of space bending around. And this man who's running down the street is now in a wheel that is going on forever. And again, this idea of the way he uses this manipulation of the physical world to represent the kind of psychological intensity of the dream world. Now, Winsor McCay went on to create what is known for his most famous work, Little Nemo, in Slumberland from 1905 to 1911, and then later In the Land of Wonderful Dreams, 1911 to 1915. This was truly a tour de force of incredible artistic ability, and where Winsor McCay could really show off his incredible skill. Just a note to tell you a little bit about Winsor McCay. He had his background he learned to draw by making circus posters, and he was so skilled and so fast at doing it. He would look at something. He would look at it and draw it in his mind, such that he could then walk back to his studio where he would draw it from any perspective. So if he saw a train, he would study it in his mind, and then he could go back into his studio and draw that very same identical train without any other reference, and he could show it flying through the sky. He was really incredible that week after week, that he could produce these amazing, colorful, and spectacular images. Now, Little Nemo, as we see him here, is a boy in this dream world. And his dreams are fantastical and outrageous and colorful. And again, in the very last little panel at the very end, we see him waking up Oh, Mama, why can't I sleep a little longer? He's about to meet the princess. So the story here is always a little bit on the slight side. They're not as psychological as the dreams of the rarebit fiend. He's really just trying to make something of a spectacle, showing off his incredible drawing ability and incredible colorful pages. William Randolph Hearst, who ran this, loved this strip. And it really wasn't that popular. It was a lot of visual gimmickry, but not a lot of substance. His most spectacular pages did leave you with an amazing sense of awe. Here in this really beautiful sequences of images, we see Nemo wake up and realize his bed is sprouting legs and walking out the door and then galloping like a horse down the street until it gets tangled and he falls out and lands outside his bed. And it's really interesting in this one how the very last frame refers us back to the very first frame. It's as if the dream is kind of endlessly cycling back again and again. It's a really spectacular piece, amazing artistry, the way he was able to create the rhythms of the legs and the moon behind it is just really incredible to see. Winsor McCay, when he wasn't doing all this amazing, incredibly rich drawing, in the evenings he would go out and perform in vaudeville theater, what was known as chalk talks. This was a popular pastime in the vaudeville theater, is where an artist would come up with large sheets of paper and would draw anything that the audience desired quickly without any hesitation. And so this is part of what people were really excited about in the chalk talk, was the way this sort of storytelling, banter, as the artist, you can see the drawing come to life. Now, Winsor McCay, when he did his chalk talks, there was no pencil outlines to begin with. He literally had a bottle of ink and a brush and would just have at it. And you can see recordings, films of him doing his chalk talk, and he just incredible, the speed at which he can realize these incredibly complicated characters that he was so famous for. Not satisfied with just entertaining people, he began to develop some ideas about this new form of entertainment called animation. And he was an early pioneer of incredible sophistication, where he had his first foray into this Gertie the dinosaur, where he drew thousands and thousands of cells and then photographed each one to make a film of this dinosaur coming out of its cave and eating a tree and interacting with Winsor McCay on the stage. This was so stunning and so unbelievable. It took the audiences, they couldn't believe that it was not a real dinosaur that he had trained. At least that's what the stories say of this character. Little Nemo in Slumberland shows his virtuoso way of manipulating space and the way he could create funhouse mirror illusions of distorting things in such a way that would be so easy today in Photoshop, but he does with such exceptional skill. Week after week after week, he kept making these amazing pages of incredible skill. Little Nemo in Slumberland was made into a musical, and a lot of these comic pages had that treatment. Their popularity was put on the Broadway stage to great success. Other spectacular pages that could be found on Sunday were Gustav Verbeek's The Upside Down. And so what you would do is you would read this forward, and then you would flip the page over and start reading it again. And all the pages that made sense one way made a different sense when read upside down. Really very ingenious and fun. Other spectacular pages following in the tradition of Little Nemo, where Harry G. Dart's The Explorigator and Lionel Feiniger, a fairly famous painter in the Bauhaus school, tried his hand at the Kinder Kids in 1906. The thing was, these big, spectacular pages of colorful adventures were only modestly popular. The real engine that was driving the innovation in the comics pages was actually something much more humble, simpler, direct, more immediate. In the sports pages, comics starts to appear, and this is because there was these artists whose job it was to illustrate sporting events. Cameras worked too slow to capture the action of the sports, so artists were often employed to draw images of the sporting action. These artists on slow time might pick up a pen now and again and make a comic. One of these was Claire Briggs, who had this idea of a guy who absolutely loved horse racing, a piker clerk. And this was a very short-lived little feature that popped up daily in around the horse pages. And Claire Briggs would actually follow the action in the horse races and pick a race that was actually happening. His little hero, piker clerk, would bet on one of the horses, and however that race turned out, he would commiserate over his losses or celebrate his victory. Following on this idea, Bud Fisher in the West Coast did a very similar kind of strip. Started out with this guy named Mutt, short for Muttonhead, this tall, lanky character who would bet on horses. And he eventually teamed up with this short character, Jeff, and the two were a comedy team right out of vaudeville. There was slapstick, there was humor, verbal entendre, and they sparred in a way that made people really enjoy the repartee of Mutt and Jeff. And they had all kinds of adventures. Now, Bud Fisher was really canny, and what he did was very early on, he copyrighted his own characters, such that when he moved to New York and kept the strip going there, he actually was paid royalties for his ownership of his comic strip. Now they tried to take that away from him, but he fought tooth and nail, carried it all the way to the Supreme Court, where he became fabulously wealthy for owning the copyright to his own strip. Now, Mutton Jeff would go on and have a huge popular career. Once Bud Fisher had won his case, he passed the project of maintaining the strip onto some ghost artists as early as 1921. And he went on and became a wild alcoholic partier who quickly squandered all his cash. And in the end, really didn't have any other ideas for any further characters. The strip was sustained for a long time. Bud Fisher's name was on the strip when it was taken over by Al Smith from 1907 to 1954. And then Al Smith used his own name until 1983. Mutton Jeff was continuously published for 76 years. Which seems like an incredibly long time and makes it an amazingly successful strip. But if you look at the top long-lived comic strips in the United States, it doesn't even make it into the top 10. Katzenjammer Kids has run for 125 years. Gasoline Alley, 103. Barney Google, Snuffy Smith, 1990 for 102. Popeye, 102. Blondie, 91. Dick Tracy, 91. Alley Oop, 89. Little Orphan Annie, 86. And Prince Valiant for 84 years. The longevity of these creations has been because they are really owned by the syndicate. That inevitably they want to sustain these intellectual properties that they own, And so when one artist offends them or dries up with ideas, they hire another one to take it over. So many of these strips have seen numerous different artists take the helm. So the Syndicate has really been a very powerful feature in American comics. It's provided continuity, it's provided decent wages for the artists that get into the system, but it's also been very conservative, and it's been really difficult for new talent to break into because there still is so many legacy strips on the pages of today's papers.